So let's move on and advance for the next chapter in this Planetiers World Gathering. Road ahead towards the SDGs. Our guest is Jorge Moreira da Silva, Portuguese director at OECD and chairman of the think tank Platform for Sustainable Growth. Jorge, boa tarde. Welcome. The stage is yours.
Obrigado, Pedro. Thank you, Pedro. Hello, everyone. This is not a talk the talk conference. This must be a walk the walk. I've been talking and walking on climate sustainability for more than 30 years. And if during this journey where I've been director of OECD, UNDP, Minister in Portugal, Secretary of State, member of the European Parliament, authoring the emissions trading, during this journey, I've seen some skepticism, then realism, now there is enthusiasm. So the question is not whether we should pursue a sustainable pathway, it's how and with whom. I think it's important to avoid mixing concepts. Sustainability is not about environment. Sustainability involves the social, the environmental, and economic dimension. It was not by accident that it was in 2015 that we have agreed on 3 key pillars, not just one pillar. The Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Agenda, and the financing for sustainable development, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And there is no room for complacency. While this agenda is bold, ambitious, universal, far-reaching, holistic, bringing a perspective and a comprehensive answer to climate, development, inequalities, poverty, at the same time, we have been off track. And in a few minutes, I will go to the impact of COVID in this Sustainable Development Agenda. But even before COVID, we were already off track. Let me put the emphasis on the glass half empty and then on the glass half full. The call for action that we all have received in 2015, it was not for governments or for experts or for NGOs. It was something to empower citizens as taxpayers, as consumers, and as voters. And this agenda set very clear targets and objectives. On financing, we knew that it would not be possible to overcome the 17 Sustainable Development Goals without providing $2.5 trillion additional dollars every year. On sustainability, you knew that it would not be possible to address climate and biodiversity without ensuring that we have a comprehensive action on poverty and inequalities. So we cannot confuse sustainability with environment. When we have 700 million people facing extreme poverty, 1 billion people without access to electricity, 2.4 billion people without access to sanitation, when women have carried on unpaid care and work 4 times more than men, when we see even on countries that have managed to rescue people from extreme poverty, that they still face inequalities. So it's important that we address the sustainable development in a comprehensive manner. So we still have a lot to do based on the fact that the crisis that we have been seeing, and now we have another one with the pandemic, it's a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a migration crisis, a refugee crisis, an inequality crisis, but also a confidence crisis, a trust crisis. So this is a testing case for the humanity, for multilateralism, and for all that are focused on the policy making. As I have mentioned, we were already off track. Level of emissions have reached the peak. I hope that we have reached the peak, but it's quite unacceptable that even after the Paris Agreement, the emissions continue rising, even in some contexts and in some countries where the technologies were already available and poverty was not a key issue. I understand that in developing countries, that they still need to compatibilize poverty eradication with climate mitigation. But in many, many developed economies, where the emissions have grown, we would have already the chance to get the peak of the emissions several years ago and not now. So we have been off track on climate. As I've mentioned with some figures on poverty and on inequalities, we have been also off track in that area. But let me put also the emphasis on the good outcome, because there is no room for complacency, but at the same time, we need to recognize efforts, we have to recognize action, and to reward the merit for those that have taken the lead. And we have seen a remarkable technological revolution on climate and on the green economy. Remarkable. With a reduction on costs of several technologies that outperformed compared to what the scientists and experts were telling us. I still remember the conversation about electrical mobility and the projections about the number of cars that would be put in place. What we have seen now goes much beyond what several experts have told us that it could be achieved. The cost of technology on solar, on wind, on energy storage has dropped immensely. Now we have renewable energy being cheaper than any fossil fuel technology in more than 70% of the countries in the world. So it's not in Europe, it's not in Portugal, it's not only in some countries where renewables are cheaper than coal. In 70% of the world, it's already cheaper. This was not something that we would have expected a few years ago. So it's quite positive. The green economy has grown more than 4% a year. We have seen several projections that the implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals will generate 380 million additional jobs. We have now 30 trillion of assets under management that target sustainability. BlackRock, the biggest fund, announced that they will never fund again anything that is toxic, anything that is a stranded asset. So the money, the finance, the private sector is taking responsibility, not just because it makes sense for reputational concerns. If you don't fulfill the rules, if you are off track on Paris, if you are off track on pollution, you will be undermined by your consumers, by the policymakers, by courts, but they are doing much more than that. They are taking the lead because they know that going green means making money, creating jobs, and generating more prosperity. And this is very positive. So you can see that in one hand we are off track, but in the other we are seeing amazing progress in the green economy. And we have our kids in the street. They are taking the lead. They are scrutinizing us. When do we sit at the table, at dinner, with them, they are asking us, what are you doing for our generation? So we are all under a huge pressure. Not the pressure from legislators, not the pressure from just the rule of law. Those that don't fulfill the right track will have huge problems, not in the long future, on the long term, but already now. We can see the power of the youth on climate. We can see the capacity of the private sector putting solutions in place and the entrepreneurs. But we still need to address some issues that I will left to the end of this conversation. Let me now share some concerns with you regarding COVID and how can we take in concern the fact that we were already facing huge problems before COVID. We were off track. We have also good evidence. The fact, as at OECD, we have outlined that if you go green, if you mainstream climate in your macroeconomic policies, it will generate 5% additional GDP until 2050. So the evidence is aligned with this narrative. But again, what's the impact of COVID in this agenda? And we have to be sure that we don't enter into a dichotomy of choosing between economy and sustainability, choosing between us and them, choosing between finance and policy. We have to be smart, we have to be bold, we have to be honest, we have to be brave. And this means that we have to start by saying that while the crisis may have been symmetric, affecting us all, the impacts of the crisis are asymmetric. Inequalities are rising within and between countries. The poorest are the most affected within countries and worldwide. We have 100 million people, 150 million people that will be forced into poverty in the next 6 months. It's the first time in 30 years, my friends, 30 years, first time that poverty will rise. According to our data at OECD, developing countries, the poorest, are already facing a shortage of funds of $700 billion this year. Foreign direct investment is going down, trade, tourism, remittances, and they are facing the scissor effect. Put yourself in a position of an African citizen. They are getting less money from developed economies because foreign direct investment is being reduced by 30%. Public economies in developed countries are also facing the crisis, so there is less appetite to support developing countries. You cannot ask your citizens to pay more taxes because they are facing poverty. 150 million people forced into extreme poverty this year. You cannot generate more debt because you were already indebted before the crisis. 50% of developing countries were already highly indebted. So how can you generate additional resources if you cannot get it from abroad, get it from your citizens, and getting it from debt? So they are seeing the perfect storm. And those that were oil producers, commodity producers, were also facing an additional pressure, which is the commodity price is going down. So we cannot overcome this crisis without supporting developing countries. It's a matter of moral leadership, it's a matter of ethics, but it's also something that is good for all of us. There will be no solution for any of the developed economies, rich economies, if we still have developing countries facing this crisis. This war against the virus will only be defeated when the last battle is tackled. So even if we get all the vaccines in the world, if we don't provide the support to developing countries, we won't succeed. In Malawi, they have 3 ventilators. In Sierra Leone, they have 4 ventilators. In Somalia, they have 19 intensive care units. In Africa, they have 2 doctors out of per 10,000 citizens. In OECD countries, it's 40. So the sustainability dimension means focusing on poverty and on inequalities. Second, we have to focus on the Build Back Better. Okay, we have to support these countries during the crisis, facing the pandemic, and let's make no mistake, social distancing in slums in Africa or in Latin America is science fiction. Washing hands in countries where 4 out of 10 houses don't have safe water, it's fiction. So our support is vital. This is a defining moment for this generation. We will be judged for this. It's the first time in 30 years that these people around the world, our brothers and sisters, are facing poverty. So this cannot be about us and then. It's us and then. So I hope that we can integrate this dimension on sustainability. But let's focus on the Build Back Better. What does it mean, Build Back Better? It could not be just Build Back Greener. Build Back Greener, it's key, but we have to bring an holistic perspective. After the Big Depression and the World War, we have found solutions. Marshall Plan after the World War II. Now we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have a Marshall Plan. It's called Sustainable Development Goals. This is our Marshall Plan. So let's make sure that we use the SDGs as the framework for all action, all reforms, all financing to overcome this crisis. Second, we need to boost multilateralism. This crisis have revealed that we are totally interconnected and interdependent. And there are some crises, some challenges that cannot be solved alone. We need global responses to global problems. Third, we need to foster solidarity, as I have mentioned. More ODA. ODA means official development assistance. We need to increase ODA. We need to engage in debt relief, and we need to mobilize the private sector also in support of sustainable development in developing countries. And I'm optimistic about this. You know, $300 trillion available in the capital market and in the pension funds. $300 trillion. We just need 1% of that. 1% of that to support the SDGs. At the same time, we have to face it very clearly, the reputational risk that we are incurring if we don't get it right. Do you know how much money G20 economies mobilized to rescue their economies in the last 6 months? 11 trillion. $11 trillion to rescue the rich economies. That's great. It shows that the state has a role to play. The state makes sense. State and governments must lead by example, mobilizing resources when it is most needed. But you know how much ODA, official development assistance, is being provided for the poorest countries? $153 billion. 70 times less than what rich economies have mobilized in the last 6 months to rescue themselves. Do you know how much money has been mobilized for vaccines to make sure that we found the vaccine, that the vaccine is released to all countries and to all citizens in the world? $600 million. And they have asked for $2 billion. So the rich economies managed to get 11 trillion to rescue the economies, but they did not manage to get more than $600 million to ensure that the vaccines would be provided for countries in Africa and in the poorest countries. So solidarity is key. Fourth key element, it's about focusing on policy beyond finance. Finance is a sine qua non condition. That's good. Everybody's talking about finance. The trillions, the billions, the funds from the EU, the funds from the World Bank. That's great. We need to rescue the economies. But money alone won't fix the problem. We have to take brave structural reforms to create the enabling context. Because if the problem was money, the 300 trillions would have already targeted the sustainable development. So we really need to create the conditions for entrepreneurs, for asset managers, for commercial banks to realize that putting €1 or $1 in this area is not philanthropy, even if philanthropy is fundamental. It's something that makes sense because it is reliable, it's profitable, it's robust. And that's the role of policies, creating the enabling context, structural reforms to make sure that we have investment that is selective and reproductive. And finally, I would say, in my next 2 minutes to close, we have to focus on action. And let me give you just one example, because I cannot go through the 17 SDGs. On climate, walking the talk and not just talking the talk means ambitious targets. We have to implement the Paris Agreement targets at home, but we have to put more ambition on those targets. The Paris Agreement makes sure that we avoid the 5 degrees increase, but we are far beyond from the 1.5 degrees. With the current pledges in the Paris Agreement, we will get 3.1 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees. Second, you have to put a price on carbon pricing, through emissions trading, cap and trade schemes, carbon taxes. You have to foster electrical mobility, public transportation, renewable energy, energy efficiency. And you have, and I would conclude with that, to empower citizens. The game changers are the citizens. It's not the technology. So let's walk the talk. Thank you so much.